welcome everybody. This is the last in the series of commercial courses that I've been doing. So it's, I'd like to say that it's a very fun and exciting kind of subject, but unfortunately it's a little bit on the dry side. So bear with me. Here we go. So this is working with commercial landlords. The first question, of course, is what kind of lease is it? This is a very important question, of course, that you need to determine when you're talking to a landlord. What kind of lease is it? Is it a lease or is it a sublease? A lease is when the property is vacant or will shortly be vacant and you're dealing directly with the landlord. The previous tenant has vacancies or their lease one way or another is null and void. Okay, so you're working directly with the landlord on this one. Okay, a sublease. A sublease is when you work with an existing tenant that wishes to vacate the property, but there is an existing lease in place. In this case, you're dealing with the sub-landlord. The sub-landlord, what it says, has the right, must have the right to sublease the property. You should review the existing lease or speak to the landlord, not the sub-landlord, to confirm that the sub-landlord has the right to sublease. Okay. Most do, I find. I think there's very, very, very rarely have I seen a lease that says under no circumstances whatsoever is the tenant permitted to sublease the property. It's pretty rare. The landlord would like to get another tenant, of course, instead of being, out months and months and months of potentially out months of income. And so normally the landlord is happy to get a tenant in there. And usually the clause says something like the tenant has the right to sublease or assign or sublease the premises with the approval of the landlord, of which approval shall not be unreasonably withheld. That's usually what it says. But the key to dealing with somebody who has a sublease is you need to see the existing lease. You don't want to go through all of this with a sublease and list it and get a cooperating agent or even yourself maybe that has the tenant, and then find out later that actually the tenant does not have the right to sublease the property. The other part that I've got a bit highlighted in orange at the bottom is really important. In just about every case out there, the sub-landlord remains responsible for the lease. So the tenant wants to sublease. So you do want to make sure when you're working with a sublease that the sub-landlord that they understand that the sub-landlord remains responsible for the lease when they sublease it, okay? Make sure they understand that. It's a key feature. So questions for the landlord. We're going to go through these. When is it available? How about free rent, landlord's lease? How many square feet, electrical service? Zoning, some specifics for some mechanical or heavy duty equipment leases, security, parking, signage, fixtures, and chattels. We're going to go through these. So availability, pretty straightforward question, right? However, if the property is still tenanted, has the existing tenant been given written notice to vacate, and has the tenant acknowledged that? Is the existing tenant in breach of contract, or is this a fixed term that is ending? We're going to talk a lot about the difference between the Residential Tenancy Act and the Commercial Tenancy Act. If it's a fixed term that is ending and the landlord and the tenant have not agreed upon a new term, the tenant has to leave. It does not revert to month. Is the existing tenant in a breach of contract? If the existing tenant is in a breach of contract, in other words, they haven't paid rent, that's the most common breach of contract. The landlord, and we'll talk about this in a few slides, the landlord does have the right to change the locks on the door and get rid of the equipment. And so, you may need a few extra days before you can release it if that's the case. Should the landlord have been given written notice? The answer is yes. Does the tenant have to acknowledge it? Preferably yes, but not under the Commercial Tenancy Act, okay? So the fixed term ends, You're being noticed to vacate. Bye-bye, Mr. Tenant. You are gone. It does not have the same remedies as the Residential Tenancy Act. It is totally different, almost 100% different, 180 degrees different, whatever you want to say. It is definitely a different thing. And we do go through some of the major terms of the Commercial Tenancy Act in a few minutes. Free rent. A good idea to talk to the landlord early about this. Most tenants, not all, but most tenants want a month or two. I've seen 3. I've seen 4, maybe once or twice, not much longer than that. But most tenants want a month or 2 to prepare the property for their business. In normal cases, base rent is excluded, but TMI and utilities usually becomes the tenant's responsibility immediately. And there are clauses to take care of this, of course, okay? So you don't want to surprise your landlord way down the line after, you know, and lots of commercial properties, they're on the market for 2 months and 3 months and 4 months. You'll see 120 days and 130 days and 60 days and 90 days on the market. And then all of a sudden your landlord gets a surprise. Oh, by the way, the tenant wants 3 months free rent. That's to discuss this early with your landlord. Okay, so that if you do get an offer on the place, on the property, that the landlord doesn't go, what's this about free rent? Best to talk about it early. Hopefully it doesn't happen, but it's pretty common that there's free rent given by landlords so that a tenant can set up their business. Okay, there's a whole bunch of clauses to do with free rent. One of the ones I really like a lot says that the tenant can have, let's just say, 2 months free rent. Base rent is excluded, but TMI and utilities becomes the tenant's responsibility. However, if the tenant opens for business earlier inside that 2-month period, the tenant will pay a proportional amount of the base rent. So you take the monthly rent, divide by 30, get the number of days that they're there. Let's say that they're half the month, they're going to pay half the rent because they're using the place for business, and they're not, you know, they're getting free rent. And so often a landlord will want to get that proportional part of the rent when the business is actually up and running earlier than anticipated. The landlord's lease. This is a common problem. If there's a landlord's lease, you may consider relating this fact in brokerage remarks of the MLS listing, something as simple as landlord lease to be executed prior to occupancy. So that there's no confusion here. We've seen quite a few leases, commercial leases go through, and it's all accepted. Everything's good to go. Okay, Form 511 or Form 510, and we'll have a look at those forms shortly, are executed. All the conditions have been met. And all of a sudden, the landlord's lease pops up that the tenant has to sign to make it, official, when there was no idea that there was a landlord's lease to start with. So if you are representing the landlord, do they have their own lease? In a plaza, probably there's the landlord's lease. In a condominium plaza, there could easily be a landlord's lease. Even in an office building, could be a landlord's lease. They're very, very, very common. Don't hide the fact that there's a landlord's lease, okay? Avoid any confusion. The co-op agent should have a condition in Schedule A stating this offer is conditional upon review of the landlord's lease, okay? I have seen only a couple times that Form 510 or Form 511, everybody's agreed on everything. And then the landlord lease comes out and there's all sorts of other stuff in there that the tenant goes, if I would have known about this, I would never have gone this way, okay? So you do have to be very careful about that. And one of the big problems in a landlord's lease today that tenants need to be aware of, and we talked about this last week, is that a demolition clause could be in the lease. Now, usually on Form 510 or 511, you wouldn't have a demolition clause in there, but in the landlord lease, there could easily be a demolition clause. And oh, surprise, surprise, you know? So you want to be upfront so that there's no confusion and a big hassle and mutual releases and all that kind of stuff. There is no standard condition for this. Lease Com 34 comes close, but usually requires some alterations to Lease Com 34 to talk about a landlord's lease and make it conditional, okay? So just as a bit of a hint to you. So you do want to ask the landlord if there is a standard landlord lease, okay? I've seen some commercial agents attach the landlord's lease right to the schedule. On the MLS listing, you know how you see a Schedule B? I've seen the landlord's lease attached to that. That's a beautiful thing. Why not? You know, I mean, then there's no confusion, there's no questions, there's no, oh my gosh, what if, you know, kind of thing. So be upfront about a landlord's lease, please. So square footage, how many square feet is usable and how many square feet is rentable? Rentable square feet includes a common area. Usable square feet is the actual space occupied by the tenant. The tenant will pay for rentable space, which includes the proportional space of lobbies, washrooms, hallways. Maybe there's some kind of a little lunchroom, who knows, but it's shared space that anybody can use if applicable. And the usable area, of course, is what the tenant will pay for. So this would be typical in an office building where perhaps there's washrooms on each floor, where there's a lobby. Maybe there's even a security guard at the front door, who knows? Maybe there's a little walkway somewhere, who knows what can be, and there's so many examples. So you just don't pay. So the rentable area could be 600 square feet, where the usable area is 500 square feet. Your tenant is going to pay for the rentable area, okay? So when you're talking to a landlord, if it's a standalone building, it's pretty much just, you know, the usable area is equal to the rentable area. And that is often the case in lots of examples. A plaza is a good example of that. There's no shared areas in a plaza, okay? Not normally. I mean, some plazas do have a washroom actually, but they're pretty rare. And so usually the usable area is equal to the rentable area. But a place like Yorkdale Mall, as an example, you're going to have the usable area is where, you know, the Gap has their store, but they're also paying for a proportional part of all the rest of this open space in Yorkdale Mall. And it's all adjusted and it's all very clear in the landlord's lease on what those differences are and how the proportional share is calculated and all that good stuff. But as a representing a landlord, you want to make sure you know this, okay? Electrical service. Some tenants, depending on the intended use, will require upgraded electrical. So a great question for your landlord: what is the electrical service size? Okay, is it 110 volts? Is it 220? Is it 440? What is it? Okay, if you're working with a landlord in a warehousing situation, some kind of industrial neighborhood, you know, what is the electrical service size is a key question that you want to be able to advertise. It can be very, very useful for tenants and their cooperating brokers to know what the electrical service size is. You want to ask that question. Zoning. I love this one. A commercial zoning on MLS is useless. You look at, I'm going to take a guess at least half of all MLS commercial listings for rent. It says zoning commercial. Well, wait a sec. We already know it's commercial because it's not listed under residential. Can you put commercial down? Absolutely you can. Are you being absolutely lazy? Yes, you are, okay? Commercial zoning means nothing, okay? The question is, what is it? What is the zoning? I mean, I don't know what an RM2 107 and 92 is. I don't know what an RM6 1284 is, an R6 254 88 and 175 88. I picked these out of the Richmond Hill zoning map for commercials. I have no idea what these things are. Okay, so sometimes you'll see in a residential, I'm sorry, in a commercial listing, you'll see commercial zoning. Well, that does the tenant and the cooperating brokerage no good whatsoever. We know it's commercial. It's in the commercial MLS portion. Okay. If you put down RM2 10792, well, what is that? What exactly does that mean? What are the permitted uses of RM2 10792? And by the way, I have no idea. I didn't look it up. But should you probably try to find out at least some of the permitted uses? And you see that in some really good listings. You see in the commercial zoning section on the MLS data sheet, you will see that they do have a number like this and letters and numbers. And then you'll see in brokerage remarks or client remarks, you'll see something wonderful like suitable for a welding shop, suitable for a woodworking shop. Like the listing agent has actually done the homework. And what it does for you as the listing agent is it stops the million phone calls coming to you, all the questions. Hey, can I put a bakery in? No, it's for a welding shop. How many times do you want to say that? And so it may help you to do a little bit of homework and find out what the zoning is, okay? And I mentioned this last week as well. Please remember that just because the property now has a bakery, it may not be zoned for a restaurant. Be careful what you say on MLS or to a cooperating agent. Ultimately, the zoning should be the cooperating agent's responsibility, okay? They should have a clause, we talked about this last week when representing a tenant, that they should have a clause in the offer for zoning, okay? Some won't, but be accurate, okay? Zoning is a requirement on the MLS data sheet. You have to put it down, and what a lot of agents do, just back to the top of the slide, it says commercial zoning, that's what they put in. Great, it's zoned commercial. Well, that does no good at all for anybody. It does no good at all. And when you think about it, some agent out there is going to go, oh, it's good for commercial. You do a lease, they open it up, they put in a bakery, they haven't bothered to check the zoning. The zoning examiner comes around and says, you can't put a bakery in here. The tenant leaves in the middle of the night and your landlord's out again. So probably best to do a little bit of homework in the background for zoning to help your landlord in case that scenario happens, but to help cooperating agents with their inquiries. And if you know exactly what it's good for, it's going to cut down a lot of questions on cooperating brokerages calling you and asking you, what's it good for? Okay. Garage door height, truck bay height, ceiling height, and floor load. These are all to do with more of a manufacturing or mechanical type of facility. But I can tell you what, a lot of industrial places and warehouses are being rented out because of garage door height and truck bay height and ceiling height, okay? The garage door height is really important for, moving in, I don't know, fridges or something like that. That a 12-foot door is a much easier garage door to move a fridge in than an 8-foot door, or even sometimes smaller. 7-foot doors and 6-foot doors, I mean, some of them are really small. The truck bay height is another really important one. Truck bay height is what's meant by that is, if I back a truck up to a door, how high is the loading bay? And so, is the loading bay good for a pickup truck? Does it need to have a semi truck in there? A dump truck or, however high, that kind of a thing. This is really important information to put on an MLS data sheet, okay? Ceiling height, this could be very important as well. I mean, 500 square foot of space on the floor that has a 20-foot ceiling has a lot more space to store stuff than a 500 square foot floor that only has a 10-foot ceiling. Let's face it. So those kind of things are really, really good to know. Bring a measuring tape with you. As real estate agents, you should all have measuring tapes anyways, but bring a measuring tape with you, one of those electronic laser beams that you can point and figure out how high things are, okay? Really, really important to know those details on your MLS data sheet. Once again, it helps the cooperating broker, it helps the landlord, and it helps you that you don't get a million questions. Okay, so if you have that information in advance, it really helps. Now, floor loads are a little bit different, and there's all sorts of floor load reasons out there, but the most common one that most of us would run into is for like a garage mechanical shop. Can it hold 4 trucks, cabs and everything else on the floor? What's the floor made out of? I ran into a problem with a laundromat many years ago where there was a laundromat with regular washing machines and dryers that we're all used to seeing in the laundromat. And the potential purchaser wanted to put in 2 of those super duper big washing machines, so that you could do blankets and duvets and things that a normal washing machine couldn't do. And we had to get an engineer in to see the floor structure to see if they could take the weight of those 2 machines. Unfortunately, in this example, the floor could not take the weight, but it was good to learn about how engineers go about doing that and calculating the weight and stuff. So floor load may be important for a garage, okay? And so do keep that in mind as well. And perhaps your landlord has the answers to these questions. So you want to talk about that when you're in this kind of manufacturing or a mechanical type of facility. Hours. If this is in a mall, office building, or plaza, a note stating hours of operation may be helpful. Hey, you're just trying to attract a good tenant without going through all sorts of bull, right? Security. Is there security? If yes, it may be positive. If you're in a really dangerous part of town, I guess it's still positive, but you're still in a dangerous part of town. But you may want to mention this in MLS, just like sometimes on the residential side, you see in a condo building that there's a 24-hour concierge or 24-hour security, that kind of thing. That could be helpful to attract prospective tenants to a particular property, okay? Parking. The landlord needs to tell you, we talked about this from the tenant side last week, is there exclusive parking or is it general parking in a plaza? Is it only street parking? This is an MLS requirement for most commercial units that you have to put down the number of parking spots, whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive, how many. Normally, signage, not a lot would be mentioned on the MLS unless there was a positive feature. Street pylon signage available. That's a big deal for people who want to rent in a plaza. Can you get onto the street pylon sign? The TD Bank's at the top and Food Basics underneath the TD Bank and McDonald's is underneath that. What spot is available perhaps? Is it going to replace an existing spot? Is there a new spot coming up somewhere else on the sign? You want to talk to your landlord about that. Normally, unless the landlord has been given some kind of specific notice from a property management company, a condominium corporation board of directors, or the city itself, that the signage that they have up now, there's something wrong with it. Normally, it's not a big deal, okay? It is a big deal from the tenant side, of course, and when you get an offer that has something specific about signage in the offer, well, then you have to do your homework and track it down and see, whatever the tenant is asking, if that can be allowed. Fixtures and chattels. So what's included? We're talking about a restaurant here, as an example. What's included? Is it the landlord's furniture in there? I mean, a prospective tenant is coming into your property to look at it, and there was a restaurant in it, and there's all sorts of tables and chairs and forks and knives and stuff. Well, whose stuff is this? Is it the landlord's stuff? You really need to have a sit down and figure out what's included and what's not, okay? we had a case where the existing tenant kicked out because they didn't pay the rent, and the tenant had installed a walk-in freezer, okay, at quite an expense. Remember, leasehold improvements done by a tenant become the property or problem of the landlord at the end of the lease. So in this case, guess what? The landlord got to keep the walk-in freezer. Okay, the tenant had made a fixture on the property. When they make a fixture on the property, it becomes the property of the landlord. So you want to talk about that. If the tenant is still occupying the property, but he's leaving in 30 days, as an example, whose stuff? You really need to talk this out and make sure that you're creating a list. Same way as we talked about last week, on the chattels and fixtures, the tenant's going to want to see what's included and what's not in this. And so you do want to be clear with the landlord if there is anything included. I mean, obviously, if it's vacant, it's vacant. I mean, that's easy. But is there stuff that is going to go with the tenant when he leaves? Is it going to stay as the property of the landlord? This has caused some big problems in leases. Is who's at the end? Who owns what? I should say at the end of the lease. And so you want to be clear from the very beginning on who owns what. Okay. Questions for the sub-landlord for sub-leases, obviously. Once again, in addition to all the above questions, you must see the lease that the subtenant will be assuming. How much time remaining in the term? Is there a second or third term available? Okay, saw one a few weeks ago. The subtenant was trying to lease a place out for 4 months. There was no second or third term available. Oh my goodness. Do you think he could get it leased out? No, he could not. How much time remaining in the term? Are there second or third terms available? What's going on? Okay. Questions that a co-op agent will want to know. You can, with a sublease, sometimes, if it's a sublease, you can try working with the tenant. You can try to work with the landlord as well and say to something like the sub-landlord, you know what, this sublease isn't the greatest lease anymore. It's only got 4 months left in the example I just gave you. How about we talk to the landlord and see if we can cancel this lease altogether and just work with a brand new lease and start new? Can that happen? And the answer is yes, that can happen. Depends how much time is left in the lease. If it's kind of a brand new lease, probably not. If the lease is coming to an end, probably yes. You can probably negotiate with the sub-landlord and the landlord to figure out a new lease that may be better to attract another tenant. Okay, so once again in red, remember that in a sublease situation, the sub-landlord remains ultimately responsible for the lease. Okay, so do remember that. Forms. So the forms, we're going to have a look at these forms. Okay, working with a commercial realtor, listing agreement to lease, listing agreement to sublease, the MLS data sheet, and an appointment information sheet. I don't have an example of an appointment information sheet, but you guys are all familiar with that if you've done any residential or any other commercial sales or leases. We need an appointment information sheet. That's the sheet that tells us how a cooperating agent can show the property. Okay. Once again, please remember that when working with a corporation that you must see the articles of incorporation. You have to ensure that the person signing as a sub-landlord or on behalf of the landlord, if the landlord is an incorporation, that they have the ability to bind the corporation. Okay, got to be sure, you guys. All right. So working with a commercial realtor, once again, this is not a residential property. You should be using Form 815, working with a commercial realtor. It basically says the same thing as the working with the realtor that you use for residential. It's not a lot different. It's got client information, it's got customer information, what happens when you represent both sides, critical information. Basically, it's the same thing as a regular working with a realtor. Not a lot different at all. So here's your landlord representation agreement for a listing, form 525. Basically, it's, you know, it's got the brokerage, the landlord, what's being leased, part of the real property municipally known as, if that's the case, when does it start, when does it end, for lease, for a rent of, the commission amount, you know, that kind of thing. Commercial leases run a little bit differently for commissions. Typically, it would be 8% of the base rent for the first year and 4% of the base rent for any subsequent years, not including any additional terms. Sorry, I kind of screwed that up a little bit. My apologies. 8 and 4. So it's 8% of the base rent for year one and 4% of the base rent for years following the first year. Sometimes you'll see 8 and 3. That'll be 8% for the first year and 3% for following years. In that example, the cooperating brokerage would get 4% for the first year and 1.5% for any subsequent years. If it's 8 and 4, the cooperating brokerage would get 4% for year one and would get 2% for any subsequent years. Okay. You, as listing agents, automatically mark yourself as a residential agent if you put down a monthly rental rate. Okay. All commercial realtors, I won't say all, most commercial realtors will do 8 and 4. Or 8 and 3, okay? The commercial sublease, pretty much the same thing. Not a lot different here. Commission, not a lot different. Pretty much the same holdover period. If there's a sale, it's always not applicable. Pretty much the same thing as the standard lease. Not a lot different at all, okay? So once again, for listings, I know that, you know, let me just go back here for a second. I know that reading the part about indemnification, I think it is, sorry, use and distribution of information. If you have problems falling asleep at night, then I suggest reading section 10. It'll put you to sleep very, very quickly, okay? And I'm trying to make a little bit of fun of something that's a little bit serious because many, many, many agents have no clue what a listing agreement says. And so I suggest that you read these before your landlord signs it so that you can explain it properly. The MLS data form. The MLS data form is the same data form whether it's a lease or a sublease. Okay, it's the same data form no matter which one it is. Okay, and so, and you come down here and right here down at the bottom left-hand corner, you see lease and you check either a lease or a sublease. Okay, it's the same form when you're working with either one. Just like any other MLS data form, purple in this case, these are all mandatory kind of thing, if available. So read the small print, not mandatory for commercial condos. This is the same, the prices are the same, landlord names, possession dates, all this good stuff is the same. And it looks pretty similar actually to an MLS data sheet for the sale of a commercial property. So this is where you can tick off, what are you actually doing here? Are you doing a store? Are you doing an investment, an office, industrial? What exactly are you leasing anyways, right? That kind of a thing. Zoning, this is the one we talked about. A lot of agents just put down commercial. We know it's commercial zoning. Okay, but what kind of zoning is it? Are you going to do the homework to help your landlord and to help yourself not to get a million questions from cooperating agents. If you put down here just commercial, what is it? It could be anything at all, okay? So you do want to try to narrow it down a little bit just to save yourself all the millions of questions, if nothing else. Then just like the MLS data sheet for a sale, you have these different sections. And all of these sections have the little numbers beside it. 3, 4, 4, 5, 5, 6, 6, 7, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You can see all the different numbers beside all of these, right? And the remarks are the same, but let's just go down here. And you will see once again, here we go. So if you are leasing out an industrial property, number 18, you must put down the rail line situation. It's optional for the rest of them. If you are leasing out an office, you have to answer number 16. Elevators, mandatory, optional for everybody else. All right. Let's see here. Office, mandatory. You have to click office door or apartment office, and optional if you have to click the area for that. What else? Number of seats. If there's a liquor store, you have to put it down. If it's a sale of a business, this is for a lease, doesn't make sense. But you can get the idea. You've got price codes here for the lease. And, you know, you have to go through this carefully and see, as we talked about, the elevator. If you have clicked off an industrial property up here, you have to go put down, railway. If you clicked off industrial, you have to click down available, no, or yes, or available, yes or no, one of the three. So you have to go through this kind of, you know, very carefully and see, you know, what works for the property that you are trying to lease. Okay. Takes time. It's not easy. It just takes time. I sometimes find that the paper is easier to use than electronic on this. You can cross things out with your landlord. You can scratch things out, do all sorts of things where it may be online. It's not so easy to do. But, you know, all the paper copies are available in our offices in the filing cabinets. So those were the forms that we've looked at. All right, all available online in your web forms that then to sign as a template, transaction kit, whatever you want to call it, or they are available in your filing cabinets at whichever office any of you guys are with. So you may want to take a picture of this with your phone. So this is the Commercial Tenancy Act, okay? And so this is the link directly to the Commercial Tenancy Act, all right? I'll give you guys a second to take a picture of this so that you have it. Thankfully, I can tell you that it's not nearly as complicated as the Residential Tenancy Act. It is more in favor of the landlord by far than in the Residential Tenancy Act. Well, it's called the Residential Tenancy Act. It used to be called the Landlord and Tenants Act. They took landlord out of it. Now the Commercial Tenancy Agreement, the Commercial Tenancy Act, is definitely more in favor of the landlord than the residential side. So, Commercial Tenancy Act. Here's just a few points of the Commercial Tenancy Act that you should be aware of for your landlord, or, you know, when you're representing a tenant. There is no provision in the Act to control rent increase. That's a major difference from the Residential Tenancy Act. What payment is in the lease agreement is what stays for the specified length of the term, okay? So you have a 5-year lease of $25 a square foot. It's 5 years at $25 a square foot, okay? You can certainly have the landlord, you can set it up that, you know, in year 1, it's $25 a square foot. In year 2, it's $26 a square foot. In year 3, it's 27, et cetera, et cetera. And people use Form 510 to do that, which is the tenancy long form to do that. Okay, but if you as the landlord have agreed on $20 a square foot for 5 years, it's $20 a square foot for 5 years. There's no renegotiating halfway through. Simple as that. Security deposits. The landlord is permitted to take any prepaid rent and or security deposits, as opposed to the Residential Tenancy Act, where the security deposit can only be the last month's rent. And technically, even though all of us will go, ha, 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 they're not allowed to take more than the first month's rent. And plus the security deposit, which is the last month's rent. They're not supposed to be able to take any additional month's rent. And so in the commercial side, take as much prepaid rent as you want to ask for. If the tenant wants to give it, great. If the tenant doesn't give it, oh well, the deal falls apart. Okay. Right to entry. As opposed to the Residential Tenancy Act, the landlord does not have the right to enter the premises or have a key to the premises unless specific terms exist in the lease agreement. When you are representing your landlord, make sure they understand this. Okay? Your landlord does not have right of entry into the property like they do in the Residential Tenancy Agreement. And it's understandable. You could have a lot that your tenant could have all sorts of equipment in there, could have all sorts of stock, stereos, something like that. The landlord can't go in the middle of the night, very sorry, simply not allowed unless there are specific terms in the lease agreement. End of tenancy. In a commercial tenancy, the right to remain is not automatic. We just talked about this. If the term is 3 years, there's no reversion to month like there is in a residential tenancy agreement. The tenant is either going to negotiate another term, negotiate the rent, negotiate the length, and stay. If they don't agree, bye-bye, okay? And also as opposed to the Residential Tenancy Act, the landlord is not required to pay any interest on prepaid rent or security deposit. Excuse me. In the Residential Tenancy Act, of course, the landlord is required to pay interest on the last month's rent. It's not the case in the Commercial Tenancy Act. Failure to pay. This is probably the biggest difference from the Residential Tenancy Act. If the tenant does not pay, the landlord can change the locks on the 16th day rent is due. Wow, that's locking the tenant out. Simple as that. Done. Bye-bye. Okay. Or if the tenant does not pay, the landlord can actually seize the tenant's property 1 day following default, and 5 days following that can obtain appraisals of the market value of what is in the building and dispose of it. This is, of course, negated if the tenant pays within the 5 days. So in other words, the landlord cannot just take over the building, take what's ever in there and get rid of it, okay? Technically, the landlord has to go into, hire an appraiser, get market value for what is left in the building, okay? And technically, the market value, what would happen is that the tenant would be paid what was left from the goods in the building minus any rent, any legal fees, any costs that the landlord had, the appraisal of the stuff, that kind of a thing. 100% different from the Residential Tenancy Act if the tenant does not pay, okay? Landlord can change the locks, bye-bye, okay? But he can't just get rid of the stuff willy-nilly. He can't just take it for his own use. There's laws about that, okay? It has to be done in a proper fashion that the landlord gets paid for the rent and any expenses incurred to collect that rent. The remainder of any sale of any equipment or stock goes back to the tenant. Works kind of like a power of sale when a bank is doing a power of sale. Okay, for a mortgage, works basically the same way. When you receive an offer, you're the listing agent. We're talking about landlords here. I know it's just so obvious to say, read it carefully. but I have to put that in there. It's just unbelievable. Okay, the number of agents out there selling commercial stuff, and they get an offer. I get the offer to review, and then I say to the agent, I say, so what about this clause in Schedule A? What do you think? And the agent says, well, I haven't read it. Well, hold on. Okay. The idea is that you guys read it and you understand it so that you can explain it to your landlord. Okay. You just can't go to the landlord and say, sign here. All right. So please read it carefully. Ask me questions after you've read it, not before you have read it. Okay. Do watch for the following. Watch for tenants' amounts of leasehold improvements, free rent periods. Okay. The last thing you want is that the tenants asked for 4 months free rent and you forgot to tell the landlord and the landlord signed off on it. Oops, that's not a good idea. Okay. Or what's the amount of leasehold improvements that the tenant wants to do? What is the, what's he intending to do? He's tearing down walls. He's adding another floor. I don't know, like all sorts of crazy things have happened out there. And so do be careful, please. Does the landlord want a personal guarantee of rent? And it goes right into the last one. Many landlords want the lease in a tenant's individual name, not a corporation. Why? Well, because chasing a corporation down to pay rent is a much more difficult job for a landlord than chasing down somebody personally. Okay? Most places that want the landlord's name, not a corporation, the landlord's name, they could still be paying a check from the corporation to pay the rent, but their personal, your personal tenant is responsible to pay the rent. And so you want to talk to your landlord about that as well. Be sure the first and last month's rent includes HST. So on both forms 510 and 511, it has the amount of the first and last month's rent or security deposits or whatever amount it is. It says in the fine print, it says this amount to be applied to first and last and HST. This is the most common mistake I see on forms 510 and 511. The rent is $3,000 a month. It says $6,000 to be applied to the first and last month's rent and HST, except all it says is $6,000. It hasn't added the HST to it. Please don't forget that in a commercial lease, HST is an additional to the rent. Make sure that TMI is spelled out in the offer. Do not assume that the tenant knows, all right? You've got to be sure that if there is TMI, that it's in the offer, okay? The fact that it might be on the MLS data sheet does not protect your landlord, all right? It's what's in the lease that protects the landlord. If there's nothing about TMI in the lease, your landlord's beat if there should be TMI. And he's not going to be, or she is not going to be too happy with you if you have told the landlord to accept an offer that does not have TMI when the landlord expects that there's TMI. Please review carefully any second or third term requests concerning rent increases for Paula as well. Make sure that this is spelled out right from the get-go, that the tenant and the landlord understand how to negotiate any second or third terms when it comes to rent increases. Don't just expect that this is just going to happen naturally. I mean, maybe it could happen naturally if everyone's getting along, but usually the tenant wants to pay less and usually the landlord wants more. And so you do want to make sure that this is spelled out correctly to protect your landlord.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like our video, please hit the like button, the subscribe, and even the little bell to get notifications, just so you can stay in touch and watch more of these great videos.